It feels like every time you turn on the news, there's another school shooting. It's just heartbreaking. And it leaves you asking, why? Why do these things keep happening? So today, we're doing a deep dive into the psychology behind these horrific acts, trying to understand what leads someone to commit such a terrible act.
And going into this, it's really important to remember there's no single answer, no one-size-fits-all profile of a school shooter. It's much more complex than that. It's really more like a puzzle with a lot of different pieces that we need to put together.
Okay, so let's start piecing together this puzzle then. I think one of the first things that always come to mind is, are school shootings actually on the rise? Because sometimes it feels like they are.
Yeah, you're right. It definitely feels that way, and I think a lot of that has to do with just how much these events dominate the news cycle. But it's interesting because the research actually shows that juvenile violent crime overall has been decreasing for years.
Really?
Yeah,
Right.
and not just in schools, but across the board.
So it's not that these events aren't absolutely horrific, but our perception of how often they're happening is a little skewed. We're diving into the psychology of these acts, but it's not because youth violence is like this growing epidemic.
Exactly. And I think that makes understanding the motives behind these rare but incredibly devastating acts even more crucial. If it's not a simple increase in violence overall, what is it that leads some individuals down this path?
So what does research tell us about the why behind these actions?
Well, there was a landmark House Judiciary Committee hearing on this topic back in 1999.
Okay.
And one of the experts, Dr. Dewey Cornell, he categorized violent youth into three major groups, and the group that was most often linked to school shootings fell under the label emotionally troubled and conflicted.
Emotionally troubled and conflicted. I mean, that just paints a much different picture, right? It's
Yeah.
not just labeling someone as a bad apple or inherently dangerous. It suggests there's something much deeper going on.
Exactly. We're talking about individuals who are often battling intense feelings of alienation, anger, often depression. They may feel like outcasts, they might have been victims of bullying, or they harbor a very deep sense of injustice.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for despair, especially when those feelings are bottled up with no healthy way to process them.
And what's even more interesting is that while those feelings are certainly intense, they're also things that many teenagers experience in some form.
Right.
Yet very few, thankfully, ever turn to violence. So motive alone doesn't tell the whole story.
That's a really, really crucial distinction. I mean, it's like having all the ingredients for a cake, but that doesn't mean a cake is automatically going to bake itself. There's more to the equation.
You hit the nail on the head. Dr. Cornell, he actually referred to it as a kind of a toxic trio of factors that come together to create these tragedies.
Okay, so we had this toxic trio, right? We've talked about the motive, those feelings of anger and alienation.
Yeah.
So what are the other two elements?
Right. So the second element in this toxic trio is method, as in the method of violence. And here we have to look at how these individuals are learning about and conceptualizing violence.
Yeah.
And sadly, many school shooters are heavily influenced by the violence they see glamorized in media, movies, video games, even music.
It's scary to think about, but I guess it makes sense, right? Constant exposure to that kind of content could really desensitize you to violence.
Exactly. And that desensitization can end up distorting their perception, making violence seem like a more acceptable solution to their problems. Almost like, it's just how conflicts are resolved.
Yeah, it's like when you only have a hammer, suddenly every problem starts to look like a nail.
Yeah.
So if violence is the only solution they're really seeing modeled, then it kind of becomes their go-to too.
Precisely. And that brings us to the third element in the trio means. And in this context, it's largely about access to firearms.
Yeah, that's the heartbreaking reality, right? Because without access to guns, the scale of these tragedies just wouldn't be possible.
Right. And research has shown a clear correlation between increased gun ownership and juvenile gun-related homicides. I mean, there was this chilling example from a 2005 study on youth violence that found that.
Sorry to interrupt, but just to back up for a second, this whole toxic trio idea is really powerful because it really shows that it's not about one thing, right?
Yeah.
It's the combination of all of these factors coming together.
You're absolutely right. It's so crucial to see how interconnected it all is. It's not just, about troubled kids snapping. It's this convergence of these volatile emotions, the desensitization to violence, and then having the means to actually carry out these horrific acts right at their fingertips.
Yeah, it really highlights the complexity of the issue.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just focus on one aspect, like just mental health or just gun control, in isolation.
Exactly. Effective prevention requires a multi-pronged approach.
Absolutely. And speaking of prevention, we can't ignore the role of social media in all of this. I mean, there was that 2019 study in the Journal of School Nursing that really caught my eye, and it found a strong link between school shooters and disturbing social media activity.
Oh, yeah, that study was really revealing. They analyzed 25 school shooter cases, all from 2013 to 2019, and they discovered that nearly 80% of those individuals had at least one social media account where they posted, deeply troubling content.
What kind of content are we talking about? Like, what makes it so alarming?
Well, think direct threats, often towards specific classmates or teachers, images of guns, sometimes even posing with them. And then there's the more veiled stuff, sharing violent fantasies, expressing a fascination with past school shooters, or, really glorifying violence.
It's almost like social media creates this echo chamber where these disturbing thoughts and feelings can just be amplified.
It's true. And tragically, for those who are already grappling with a sense of isolation and alienation, this online community, even one built around negativity, can be dangerously alluring.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. It's like having a front row seat to their descent into darkness, but most people don't even recognize the warning signs.
And I think that's why that study was so important, because it really highlighted the need for parents, educators, even peers to be far more aware of what young people are posting and engaging with online. It can be such a powerful window into their mental state.
It's like you said earlier, context is everything.
Yeah.
This kind of online behavior, in a vacuum, it might not set off alarm bells, right? But when you combine it with other red flags.
Exactly. And speaking of red flags, this ties directly into some fascinating work done by the FBI. They developed something called a four-pronged assessment model to help identify potential school shooters.
Four-pronged. So they're looking at this from multiple angles. Four-pronged. So they're looking at this from multiple angles.
Exactly. It's about connecting the dots, looking across different aspects of students' life, their personality, their family dynamics, how they behave at school, and then their social interactions.
So it's not about like profiling every kid who seems a little withdrawn or has a bad day. It's about recognizing patterns. Right? What kind of things are they looking for within each of these prongs?
Yeah, think of them as red flags, not, automatic labels or anything. For example, in terms of personality, do they exhibit a low tolerance for frustration? Do they struggle to cope with setbacks? Maybe exhibit a pattern of blaming others for their problems?
Yeah, and those are all things that could like easily be overlooked as just, typical teenage behavior unless you're really looking for the pattern.
Exactly. And then you start to layer in things like family dynamics. Is there evidence of a turbulent home life? Lack of parental supervision? Easy access to weapons?
And that's where those different areas start to like really intersect, right? Because a student who's already struggling with, say, anger issues is in an even riskier situation if they also have easy access to firearms.
Precisely. And then you look at the school dynamics. Are they being bullied? Do they feel like they belong? Or are they more isolated and withdrawn?
And finally, you have their social dynamics. And we've talked about the role of social media, but I imagine it extends to their offline relationships too.
Absolutely. Are they chronically isolated? Do they have healthy friendships? Or do they gravitate more towards, others who also exhibit troubling behavior?
Wow. This whole model really highlights just how complex this issue really is. It's rarely about one single factor. It's the confluence of many.
It really is. And that's honestly why I think this deep dive has been so important. It's about understanding those nuances, not just jumping to these simplistic conclusions.
Absolutely. But this knowledge, it's only useful if we can apply it, right?
Yeah.
So for our listeners out there, what's the takeaway? What can they do with this information?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I think the most important thing is to be observant, to be empathetic. Don't dismiss warning signs, whether they're online or offline. If you see something that seems off, say something. Talk to a trusted adult.
It's about creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up, both for themselves and for others.
Exactly. And if you are struggling yourself, whether it's with difficult emotions, feelings of despair, anger, whatever it might be, please know that you are not alone. Reach out for help. Talk to a counselor, a parent, a teacher, anyone you trust. There are people who care, and there are resources available to help you navigate those really difficult feelings in a healthy way.
This has been a really heavy deep dive, I think. But ultimately, the takeaway for me is one of hope and even empowerment. We can't always predict or prevent these tragedies, but we can create communities where people feel seen, heard, and supported. And where seeking help isn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of incredible strength.